Hi, everyone. I'm Silvia Isabella, a postdoctoral fellow at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto. I'm very happy to present to you today my research entitled Unconscious Learning of Automatic Inhibition is Reflected in Frontal Theta and Sensorimotor Oscillations. I put this work together with my co-authors, Alan and Doug Shea. To begin, an important question in neuroscience is, how does the brain control our behavior? This is something that is important for normal development and is implicated in several disorders. Prominent theories on action control propose a dual process model where you have cognitive processes that are defined as mental acts of which we are conscious, that we intend, that require effort, and that can be controlled. For example, when you're just learning to drive, every action is purposeful. In contrast, automatic processes are rapid and autonomous and are thought to yield default responses unless intervened on by cognitive processes. In the driving example, this would be after you have learned to drive, you might be cruising down your neighborhood street, completely unaware of the actions you took to get to where you are. These two processes come together during inhibitory control when one is required to inhibit the easy response in favor of making the hard response. For example, cruising down your empty neighborhood street and then having to avoid a squirrel that has jumped out in front of you. Inhibitory control is often associated with an increase in a low frequency brain oscillation emanating from the frontal cortex called frontal theta. This is a slow signal that oscillates around 4 to 8 hertz, and I won't go into detail other than to explain that theta is a signal that is reliably elicited during all sorts of cognitive tasks, such as the Stroop task, the stop signal task, or even an anti-saccade task. This raises the question, if frontal theta is fairly ubiquitous during cognitive control, what is its functional role? Does this frontal signal exert influence on behavior? Let me tell you a little bit what is currently known about frontal theta. Well, we know that frontal theta oscillations increase during many types of cognitive control, as I just mentioned, including working memory, mental arithmetic, and response switching. Theta is also related to behavioral outcomes. Theta power and latency decrease during faster switches that purportedly required less cognitive load, suggesting that theta is proportional to the amount of cognitive processing required in order to execute a given response. Therefore, theta may be a good candidate signal for involvement in cognitive control, but this remains speculative and has yet to be demonstrated conclusively. The potential for frontal theta to underlie cognitive control is not only my own idea, but was discussed in this 2014 opinion paper by Kavanaugh and Frank. The idea is that theta oscillations generated within the frontal cortex may be the mechanism through which the frontal cortex produces cognitive control. In order to test this idea, I wondered if modulating cognitive control could result in a modulation of frontal theta. We considered that a great way to create differences in cognitive control is using implicit learning. That is, create a response pattern that when repeated enough times produces procedural learning. In order to assess learning, one typically breaks the pattern to see if there is a difference. That is, how the subjects perform the same task with randomly ordered instead of pattern stimuli. Not only can you use this to assess learning, but if the pattern does in fact facilitate performance, we realize that breaking the pattern will lead to an increase in cognitive effort. Next, a great way to measure cognitive effort is to use pupillometry. That is, track the change in pupil diameter with cognitive processing. This is a separate process from the pupillary light reflex, so it must be done in constant light. The advantage of this method is that it is well known to be sensitive to variations in cognitive effort across a variety of tasks, even as far as tracking unconscious processes, such as effects of subliminal priming or memories in amnesic patients who are unable to explicitly discriminate between old and new stimuli. From this, we designed a task and a study to address this question. That is, whether frontal theta is sensitive to modulations in cognitive effort. The hypothesis was that theta would correlate with pupil diameter and thus demonstrating sensitivity to modulations in cognitive effort. Furthermore, if this frontal signal has an effect on behavior, it would likely be related to behavioral behavioral measures, such as reaction times, with a possible mechanism being an interaction with signals in the sensorimotor cortex. We devised a task to address this that was published back in 2019, those pre-COVID days. The task we used for the study was a variation of a go-no-go task, where digits 1, 2, and 4 required a right-hand response, but the number stimulus 3 required a switch to the left hand. So instead of a no-go, it was more of a go-switch task. So 1/4 of stimuli required a left-hand response, and 3/4 required a right-hand response. Furthermore, there was a pattern to the stimulus order that subjects remained unaware of. So for example, if subjects were shown the number 1, 2, or 4 that was within the pattern, I labeled that trial pattern go. And this would be a low load because it was very common trial type. If they were shown the number 3 within the pattern, I labeled that trial type pattern switch, as it was a little bit less common. But for, the load was a little bit higher, as it was a little bit less common a trial type. But for 10% of 3s, I switched it out for a different number. I labeled that a deviant go. In this case, if subjects learned the pattern, they might have anticipated a left-hand switch response, but had to instead perform this unexpected right-hand go response. This might have increased cognitive load during performance. And then I put back the same number of unexpected 3s, which I called a deviant switch. So it's the same thing here. Subjects learned the pattern, they would have expected a right-hand go response, but they would have had to perform an unexpected left-hand switch response. Note this color scheme for the rest of the presentation. In order to measure frontal theta as well as sensorimotor signals, we used magnetoencephalography, and we used beamformer-based source localization method. Moving on to the results, we can see that there was a stepwise increase in reaction times from go trials to pattern switch to deviant switch trials. As for efficiency, we see the opposite effect. That is, the number of correct responses per second increased from switch trials to go trials. Furthermore, as I mentioned, we also measured pupil diameter. Pupil dilation followed a typical time course, increasing from cue onset and reaching a maximum between half and a full second later, well after the responses were executed. Comparing across conditions, there was again a stepwise increase, and but this time there was a significant difference between pattern and deviant go. Whereas you might remember there was no differences in reaction time between pattern and deviant go, there was a very significant difference between pattern and deviant go in terms of pupil diameter. So it is clear from these data that subjects increase cognitive effort for deviant go trials in order to produce the less prepared response in the same amount of time as the pattern go response. As an aside, this finding demonstrates that reaction times and pupil diameter are clearly measuring different things. Moving on to frontal theta, it was localized to the right middle frontal cortex, increasing from stimulus onset and peaking around response onset before returning to baseline. Comparing across conditions, frontal theta showed a very similar pattern of effects as pupil diameter, with a stepwise increase in power across conditions. And again, a highly significant difference between pattern and deviant go trials. Given the similarity in effect sizes between theta power and pupil diameter, I ran a regression to compare this frontal theta and pupil dilation responses. In this figure, frontal theta is on the x-axis and pupil dilation responses on the y-axis, where each color represents an individual subject and each marker represents one of the 4 conditions. I got a within subject R of 0.91, which would suggest that, similar to pupil diameter, frontal theta is also sensitive to covert variations in task difficulty or cognitive effort. Now, what about sensorimotor signals? Well, within the sensorimotor cortex, we found a 60 to 90 hertz signal. I understand it's hard to see. This is 60 to 90 hertz heat map time frequency, where time 0 is response onset. And we see, here's the same data collapsed across that 60 to 90 hertz frequency bin. When focusing on the time period preceding response onset, the signal followed the same step-like increase in power as frontal theta. So now I wanted to compare these two signals, theta and gamma. So I performed another regression, again with theta on the x-axis, this time with gamma on the y-axis, and I found a very clear positive correlation, highly significant. This relationship was similar to that found with pupil diameter. Note this is the same figure as before with theta on the x and pupil diameter on the y. Now what about behavior? Well, theta correlated significantly with reaction times and also with efficiency. No surprise here. So the last question we aimed to address was, how do these signals come together? That is, does frontal theta interact with sensorimotor gamma in order to produce behavioral control during cognitive effort? For that, we first ran a mediation analysis that demonstrates the interaction between frontal theta and efficiency was fully mediated by sensorimotor gamma. That is, the interaction between sensorimotor gamma and frontal theta helped to explain the relationship between theta and efficiency. The mechanism of this interaction between frontal theta and gamma appears to be via long-range cross-frequency coupling, specifically amplitude coupling. I've plotted here the synchronization index between theta amplitude and sensorimotor gamma amplitude. Furthermore, there was a significant effect of task on coupling strength. The implications of all this work are as follows. First, given the differences between reaction times and pupil diameter, as well as theta activity, it is clear that behavior alone may be limited in measuring cognitive effort. This is especially important to consider when comparing across different populations where you would expect to apply different amounts of effort or even different strategies. Second, we saw that frontal theta activity is strongly associated with pupil diameter and therefore also cognitive effort. These data seem to support a gradient of cognitive control and not separate automatic or cognitive processes. This has implications for dual process theories of cognitive control. Third, we saw an increase in frontal theta for implicitly learned switch responses, demonstrating that conscious awareness is not required for increased theta activity and action control. Lastly, the MEG results demonstrated a relationship between frontal theta and sensorimotor cortical signals, suggesting a functional role for theta in coordinating motor activity and guiding behavior. This clarifies the suggestions posed by Kavanaugh and Frank in the introduction that frontal theta is likely to be intimately involved with the production of cognitive control, even if we don't yet know the exact mechanism. To conclude, the main question of this talk was, are theta oscillations a mechanism through which the frontal cortex exerts control over the sensorimotor cortex and therefore behavior? The findings of this work suggest that theta activity within the frontal cortex may be the process of cognitive effort itself, involving the coordination and facilitation of downstream signaling in order to produce cognitive control, even unconsciously. Furthermore, these findings would suggest that automaticity and control exist on a spectrum, and movement along that spectrum can occur during, for example, learning or inhibitory control. Importantly, one's position on that spectrum can be determined, can be measured using either pupil diameter or even frontal theta power. With that, that concludes my presentation. I'd like to thank you for your time and attention. Thank you to my lab mates, collaborators, supervisor, funding agency. I welcome your questions and any follow-up emails that you might have. Thanks.